Of course. No, there was a long process of getting to that point. And one of the things that Sam does with such skill is to take us in the footsteps and in the thought processes of Walt of how do you get to that point. Sam was recently a speaker at the Disney Family Museum. At the end of his presentation, Diane Disney Miller came up and gave him a big hug and said, "My dad would have been so proud." After listening to him speak. We're very lucky to have Sam. He's only out here for a couple of days. He's already given a couple of speeches at some local libraries. He's got some presentations scheduled for the Disney company. But my gosh, he was just so... In fact, I drove over with Sam today, and he said this is his favorite presentation because you people get it. And so he is so excited to be doing this. And in fact, yesterday we were going to hook up briefly and we couldn't because Sam was working on improvements for this particular presentation. And so Sam Gennaway is an urban planner, so he knows how things work, he knows how places work. Ladies and gentlemen, Sam Gennaway.
That was 178 words! I knew he couldn't do it.
Practice before, knowing that I was going to be going into this crowd, so I watched the video when Jim was with you before and just studied it and listened to the questions and all that kind of thing. Actually, I would rather liken myself more to Marvin Davis than I would Joe Fowler, because Marvin Davis was the guy who did the layout for Disneyland and created the hub and spoke. Marvin Davis was the one who assisted Walt and did the refinements, as we'll see, with the idea of Epcot and the whole idea of the Walt Disney World, or at that time known as the Disney World Resort. I am honored and delighted to be with you this evening. It is true. I love doing the Disneyana thing because I'm one of you. You know, we all share that sort of passion, and we all kind of get it, and this is really very exciting. The presentation I'm going to be giving you tonight is a modified presentation that I sort of dealt just for you, but a bulk of this presentation is one that I'll be giving on May 11th in Glendale at Walt Disney Imagineering. I've been invited to speak at their Creative Inspiration Series, which was the series that Randy Pash spoke at. I hope the outcome isn't quite the same for me. But that plaque that you see in front of the Mad Tea Party was my inspiration to write this book. I wanted to do it so I could get invited to the table, and lo and behold, I get to go to Walt Disney Imagineering and talk to their senior executives about Walt's life and his passion towards three-dimensional design. And that's the journey that I intend to take you in tonight. So let's go on the journey, Walt Disney's Great Big Beautiful Tomorrows. I am your host.
I am your host.
I am your host.
I don't have any control over what he's doing up there.
And the proposition that I am going to put forth this evening, and I hope that by the time I finish this proposition, that you're going to agree with me so much that you're all going to buy my book for only $20, or two for $17.50 each, which means $35. So please buy books. As Lord only knows, I don't want to take them home with me on the airplane. My one plug for the book is that Marty Sklar had a great opportunity to spend a day with at his house. And it was quoted as stating it was one of the most accurate portrayals of the web design process that anybody had written, especially for somebody who didn't work for the company. So I'm very, very proud that Marty Sklar has given you the big thumb up. So here it is. The proposition is that Walt Disney had changed the public expectations in so many different ways that by the time that he was getting into the late years of his life, that he intended to continue doing that by changing the world, by reinventing three different things. He was going to reinvent the idea of the arts college. He was going to reinvent the idea of a mountain retreat, and he was going to reinvent the idea of the community of tomorrow, what the urban experience was going to be. I put forth that proposition because if you really think about it, the man had done that many, many, many times before. For example, he changed the public expectation for animation. No longer was animation just a visual art, it had character. The characters had character. He took the cartoon and he reinvented the idea of the movie by using color. Technology of color had been used in other films, but nobody was really using it quite the way that he was able to, so much so that Technicolor, of course, cut him a deal so that they could promote their product through Walt Disney. Charlie Chaplin was the person who really created the idea of movie merchandising, but it was Walt Disney and his company that took the idea of merchandising, something you're all familiar with, to the next level. And I think that the theme that you're going to start hearing here is that I don't believe that Walt Disney was a great inventor. What I do is believe that Walt was the great synthesizer. The man had the memory of an elephant and studied everything and retained absolutely everything. And what he had was the unique ability to combine and recombine all of these things, all the things that he knew would work, and create something that was entirely new. Need more proof? Of course we know Snow White, the first all-color, full-length cartoon. However, they did do it was in Germany, right? 1915 that they did full-length cartoons. So he just did it better. He took the money for that and he created what is now known as the modern-day industrial park, the first large industrial park in Los Angeles to be fully air-conditioned. During World War II and the sort of the dark days of the studio, he didn't just wallow in his sadness. What he ended up doing was reinventing the educational film. And from this day forward, educational films are always sort of likened to what Walt Disney was trying to do. He did the same thing to documentary films, especially animal documentary films. All of a sudden, the animals were personalities. The animals were characters. You cared about the animals just like you would a character in one of his other movies. Of course, he was the first large Hollywood movie producer to go ahead and not be afraid of television, but really to embrace it. It was the way he funded the park, but in 1950, of course, he did the film for Alice in Wonderland, the show for Alice in Wonderland, because he knew this was the medium of the future. He was so prophetic about the thing that when he was filming these shows for black and white television, he filmed them in color. And people thought he was crazy for spending the money, but he knew that color was going to come to television the same way that he knew he brought color to the movies as well. Of course, all of that came to my little home park, Disneyland. This is actually the model at the Walt Disney Family Museum, though. And then when color television needed to become the next big thing and people didn't want to spend the enormous amount of money for color television, it was Walt Disney that saved the day. He became the go-to application for television. You would buy a color television just so you could watch the wonderful world of color. And I bet many of you and your families, that was the reason, one of the main reasons you bought color television at the very beginning. And little known fact is that Walt Disney changed completely the Olympics. When you listen to these big, huge, giant opening and closing ceremonies, it was Walt Disney in the 1960 Squaw Valley Winter Olympics, the first televised Winter Olympics that had the massive, giant kind of opening and closing ceremony. So he changed the public's expectations for that. With the success of Disneyland, everybody really wanted to have a Disneyland. And they wanted to have it in their particular community. And he had a lot of credibility because of the things that he did. James Rouse, the developer who developed Columbia, Maryland, and the Seaport in New York, and a major developer, thought that Walt Disney was so good that he said the greatest piece of urban design in the United States today is Disneyland. If you think of its purpose, its meaning to people, more than that, its meaning to the process of development, you will find it the outstanding piece of urban design in the United States. Another philosopher and architect, Charles Moore, went so far as to say that by most any conceivable method of evaluation that does not exclude the public, Disneyland must be regarded as the most important single piece of construction in the West in the past several decades. Ray Bradbury, Walt's good friend, was so enamored with Walt Disney and his ability to transform that Ray Bradbury asked Walt numerous times to run for mayor. Of course, we all know the famous refrain, "Why would I want to be mayor? I'm already king." Finally, Robert Venturi, who was the person who sort of solidified the idea of postmodern architecture, was no real fan of Walt Disney at all. But he did concede finally that Disney is nearer to what people really want than anything architects have ever given them. I run into that all the time when I'm dealing with my professional peers. But you know, who would know Walt better than his wife, Lillian? A woman who I personally think had the most patience of any woman in the entire universe to put up with what her husband was constantly going through. But there was a quote that really touched me, because I've always been trying to find, as an historian, because I also work as a planning historian, of what it is that was the motivation. And Lillian had this quote that just, I think, sums up the man better. And she said, "Enthusiasm and optimism together." Walt was enthusiastic about everything, and he never thought anything would turn out badly. So when you've been having this kind of success, and you're having this much acclaim from the intellectual community, and you're having your wife just promote the idea that you really can change things, why would you not try to reinvent the city? And that's what this whole book is all about. Now, I have to take a quick step back and sort of give you some relevance and some context here. I'm as old as a mountain. Yeah, I'm as old as the Matterhorn. Okay, some of you are doing the math really quick, right? And as a little boy, I asked my mom once, as an adult, I asked her, why am I so fascinated about Disney? I can't quite figure out why I'm so fascinated about Disneyland and kind of obsessed with this sort of thing. And she told me that when I was young, and my two much older brothers, she would take us to Disneyland, and she would let my older brothers just go run around. And then I was younger, so I would sort of hang out with her. And this was at the days when you bought just a general admission ticket. So it was very inexpensive because Walt really believed that the middle class and the lower middle class should come to his park, that they should have the right to enjoy what he was doing. Now, if you didn't buy tickets for the rides, and you didn't eat in the park, because we always went out and had sandwiches out in the trunk, it actually was a very inexpensive way of spending the day. And we would go time after time, and she said we'd go about once a month to do this. And at Disneyland, since I couldn't go on any of the paid rides, I'd go on all the free ones. And there were 4 free ones. Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, Adventures Through Inner Space, Monsanto's Adventure Through Inner Space. Oh, how I missed that attraction. I forget what the 3rd one is. Jim was going to figure it out for me when I'm done here. But the 4th one was the Carousel of Progress. And this was almost the direct lift from the 1964, 1965, or what I dubbed the good version of it. And in the fourth scene was finally changed a little bit for Disneyland, and it had these very, very rich people, at least in my mind, celebrating Christmas and playing with their new video recorder and everything. And there was this glistening city in the back. And at the end of the 4th scene, when it kind of churned, instead of today where it's like, hey, thank you, goodbye, there was an escalator that took you up, or speed ramp is what it really was, that took you up to the 2nd floor. And on the 2nd floor was the most glorious model one could ever possibly imagine, the model of Progress City. Now imagine, I'm like an 8-year-old boy through 12 years old watching this thing. I would sit there, and when the thing finally stopped, I'd get up and I'd run in front of everybody, and I'd go up the speed ramp, and I'd stand there, and I would linger and linger and linger until the cast member would kick me out. And in my imagination, I would look at this, and I'm going, is this real? Could this have happened? Could you really build this? Can I go visit it? When can I go vacation it? This model is incredible. It was 6,900 square feet. It was 115 feet long by 60 feet. When you go see the little bit that you see at the People Mover today, that's less than 1/4 the size of the model. Let me make you sad for a second. Because when you look at that model, this original model had 22,000 artificial trees, 4,500 buildings, all of them that were lit. The ones that were towards the front even had furniture in the models, so that you can see that people actually lived in them. Little teeny 1/8 to the foot people. It had 1,400 street lights in the thing, and it had 2,500 moving vehicles, monorails, people movers, cars. Everything was animated. You sat there for 4 minutes when Mother and Father would talk about how proud they were of Progress City and how wonderful a place it was to live, and how they liked going to the little amusement park that wasn't quite Disneyland, but was their amusement park. And they loved the fact that they had their very clean-burning General Electric nuclear power plant just off in the distance. The model was extraordinarily detailed, and as an urban planner, I was always sort of obsessed with this idea, could this happen? Could you actually build Epcot? So I decided to go do a feasibility study the same way that I do for my clients. And when you do a feasibility study, it's kind of like an archaeologist. You sort of have to pull it apart, and you have to get to the background to sort of figure out whether the thing was going to work. So let's take a little bit of a walk through all of this, shall we? Marty Sklar, by the way, he said that the model, the Progress City model, was in fact the Epcot that Walt wanted to build here. Walt didn't believe in drawings. He thought that drawings lied, so he had everything done as models. And what he did is he took great glee in the fact that he was giving a preview to everybody in the world of what he was planning on building Florida without necessarily talking about what it was. The model was very, very accurate to what the plans were going to be. When I was doing all this unearthing, I was trying to understand why Walt was so fascinated by the built environment. And Jim is absolutely the expert on the backgrounds of the animation films. But when you look at the animation films, one of the hallmarks of Disney animation was that the backgrounds were so realistic, the plausible impossible, that he could stick a talking deer in front of a forest and you believe the deer could talk. Because the forest seemed so real, your brain said, this is logical, this makes sense. And that was very much the hallmark of Disney design. So even as an animated films, he was working and trying to create environments. He was in the Hyperion studio, very, very creative space, but it was just a nightmare of a place to work. Everybody was piled on top of each other. And it was only with the success of Snow White that he was able to go ahead and build the studio that he always wanted to. He invested $3 million in this studio, a state-of-the-art studio. And I'm not doing a lot of this stuff for my other presentations, but I figured you guys will deal with this. Let me show you a little film.
Hi-ho, it's home from work we go. Hi-ho.
The profits of Snow White, we bought the property in Burbank in 1938. We started the studio. The studio ended up costing us, with furnishings, buildings, and everything, around $3 million.
It was a wonderful place. Walt had real new ideas about what working space should be. And he had all the furniture designed by someone special, and there was air conditioning in it. It was beautiful.
The Disney Studio at that time was more like a family company.
What we had on the Disney lot was completely different from other lots. And it was a family atmosphere. Other people would come on the lot and compare it to a college campus.
Here Walt was famous around the world. I mean, even though he knew he was famous, it certainly didn't impress him, you know.
He was so accessible that you could, in fact, run into him in the hall and discuss whatever was on your mind.
Anytime I'm in an office, if it's a kind of a general business meeting, so I like to work in the units. I go around the units when they're not there, so I can just sit down with the work, and they're not putting any pressure on selling me. When I sit and relax with the work.
Walt was hungry to see the ideas that would have developed, not within the daily routine, but what they had in mind outside of that.
The boys know that I do that. And the boys pull all kinds of tricks to find out whether I've been in there. You know, they'll arrange papers in a certain way on the chairs and things, because they come in the morning and say, well, Walt wasn't in this weekend, you know, but they don't know I put the papers right back the way they were.
It was more than a Disney family. He cared about the people that worked for him. He gave you pride in yourself that you could do something, but he would ask so much more of you than what you thought you were capable of doing.
It was just the happiest place to work because you felt safe. No one was going to stab you in the back. Walt was going to always give you a chance.
We had ideal working conditions. It was beautiful.
What Walt didn't know, though, was that the animators knew what he was doing, and if the animators really wanted something that they really wanted Walt to see, they would put it in the trash can, and then Walt would discover it so that it would be his idea and go, why didn't you do this? So they were pretty clever about it as well. The thing with the thing with the movie studio was that the movie studio was probably the only time in Walt's life that he was able to build something with no compromises whatsoever. He had all the money that he needed to build the thing, and it was a very, very special place. It really, really redefined what it was like. It was not like any other studio, which were these giant barns, all kind of stacked up upon each other. The studio was beautiful. It was like a suburban office park. It looked like a college campus. The buildings themselves were set back on the streets. The streets themselves were abnormally narrow so that it made for a very pedestrian-friendly environment. A traffic calming is what we urban planners call it today. The shades of the buildings themselves, the coloration of the buildings, mimic the desert southwest sunset. The reason behind that was very, very practical, because Walt realized the animators were working in such saturated colors all the time that they needed to go outside and take a break and their eyes could relax so they can see the green, they can see the trees, they had these nice neutral buildings. More importantly, the buildings were designed specifically for artists. All of the animators had views facing north to get the absolute best possible light. The building was comfortable, as they said earlier. It was all air conditioned, and the buildings themselves followed the animation process exactly. The story started up in the third floor, usually Walt's office. got defined up on the 3rd floor, given to the art directors on the 2nd floor. They would start, the main animators would start the beginning, the end of the sequences. They'd bring it down onto the 1st floor. At the 1st floor, the in-betweeners would do the in-betweening. It would go underneath the ground, so the cells never ever went outside. Underneath all the ladies over at the ink and paint building, they would ink and paint it, and then it would go directly underneath the ground again over to the camera building and get filmed. By looking at the buildings, you could actually see how the movie was made. And then once they were getting filmed, they would go into the sound stage, and then they would end up in the theater. And the building had each things in that same sequence. It did have a little tiny back lot, but every once in a while they had to sort of use the building. So there's a Medfield College is actually animation.
Did they name that movie?
Oh, some
Computer Wore Tennis Shoes.
Yep. I was going to say, this crowd, geez, how many of you can name that? Really?
Not many, but I can.
All right. But to really know Walt, one of the things that I learned a long time ago, to really know Walt, you have to know what was one of his biggest motivations. He loved trains. We all know this, right? He loved trains. In fact, when Lionel was struggling and he licensed them the little Mickey push cart, how many of you own that? Because I bet somebody in here has one of those. The little, you know, the little Lionel where it was Minnie and Mickey and they would do this. Yeah, I knew somebody would have one here. Lionel said, well, I'll make you a deal. You know, if you saved our company, if you ever want a model train set, just ask us. We'll get you one. Walt decided he was going to get one for his nephew, Roy. And instead of just giving Roy the box, he took it to his office first, and he set up the train in the outside office. And Ward Kimball was up there during a story meeting, and Ward saw the train, and he went, oh, Walt's got a toy train. So he goes running down and he talks to the other rail fans that are in the company, and there were quite a few of them in the company. And he goes, Walt's got a train, Walt's got a train. And so they all went upstairs, and they were all hanging out with Walt, and they were loving Roy's train. I have the feeling Roy didn't get it for many weeks after when he was supposed to be getting it. But it really started to get Walt excited about something that he was very excited about as a child. He kind of rediscovered trains. And so, and he, in fact, for recreation, he would take Lillian out to the rail yards in Los Angeles, and they would stand up on bridges, and the two of them would just watch the trains go by. And Lillian said this was entertainment for Walt. He was just fascinated by him. But the real breakthrough moment came with Ward Kimball, and this was in October of 1945. And as you might know, Ward Kimball had his own full-size train. He had the Emma Nevada, which was a narrow-gauge railroad, in his backyard. It's now in Paris, California. He also had a little wood burner called the Chloe. And according to Kelly Kimball, who I know quite well now, Kelly says that they usually pulled out the Chloe because the Emma Nevada took a lot of effort to fire up. But this thing, they do it. He had about 900 feet of track, and the train would go one way, and it'd go the other way, and it'd go another way, and it'd come another way. And he'd have these little fire-up parties, but it occurred to him that he never invited the boss to go see his train. So in this date in October of 1945, Walt was at the house, got on the train, and his excitement about being on a train, he got on the Emma Nevada, and it was the first time he got to pull the throttle and play with the Johnson bar and engineer the train. And from that moment on, all he wanted was a train. He wanted his own train really, really bad. In 1948, he invited Ward Kimball to go on what I think is one of the most monumental trips, the one to the Chicago World's Fair. And I apologize for getting in your way all the time. In the Chicago Rail Fair in 1948, they went not only to Chicago, and because they were celebrities, they were treated like celebrities, and they got to ride all sorts of trains and pilot and engineer all sorts of trains. They also went to Deerfield Village and the Henry Ford Museum on the same trip. And it was on this trip that I truly, genuinely believe that Walt Disney had decided that he was kind of somewhat done with animation. He didn't mind doing live action films because they had to keep the studio alive somehow. But really what he wanted to do is he wanted to figure out a way of playing with trains for the rest of his life. And I think that everything that we've seen ever since came directly out of this trip. Quite an amazing thing. So, he wanted to train. He decided to get a train. He put one in his backyard, and it's He wanted a train, he got a train, and that train was... Who can name it? Come on, quick, while I find the slide.
Carolwood.
Right. He had the Lily Bell. Let's go for a ride on the Carolwood Pacific Fairweather route in the backyard of his home in Holmby Hills.
Great. Pull it up. There it is.
Once he finished with the locomotive, working with Roger Brokey on the locomotive, they tested it out at the studio one December. Walt Disney did personally build the entire caboose by hand. He did it as a tribute to Ward Kimball. There's inside of the inside the caboose is a calendar with Ward's name on it. You can't see it unless you actually got up to the thing and looked through the little window. That's the kind of detail that you see. The locomotive itself was a 1/8 scale 440.